There were still dark, stony foundations, gaping black holes to the underground, framed in spun glass, black shadows, and a black river. The Dark Sentinel was at the heart of it, hidden as much by light as by the shadows. It was an impossible, heart-rending beauty. It would take years to fully understand and comprehend how amazing it was. You, my guide. Holmes had their foreheads pressed together, his face more alight than even the city could manage. You are the conductor of light. You are the lens through which all things become clear. They sealed all the wordless promises with a wordless kiss. That's some good stuff. Can't believe I'm getting choked up on a Sherlock Holmes and John Watson /fic that's around, 90,000 words. Wait, that's not even the right Sherlock. I can't believe people still remember those movies. Huh. Well, it's also apparently a crossover with this late 90s crime drama I've never... Holy shit! There's 12,000 stories about the Sentinel? God, I love fanfiction. Fanfiction is a thing that is often hard to love. I can acknowledge that. Frankly, I could have saved myself the trouble and halved this video's length if all I did was list off some S-tier fics, but no, I've consigned myself to defending this whole medium of storytelling for some reason. Why? Because this video is the equivalent of me coming up with responses in the shower several days after an argument. I made an offhand joke about fanfiction in a League of Legends Discord server of all things, and was cast into the role of Pervert of the Month because apparently fanfiction is all smut or something. Well, I'm here to tell you all, fanfiction is, only mostly smut. It also has the capacity to be so much more though, I promise. My ultimate goal is to show why you should at least consider fanfiction as a supplement to your current media diet. I want to highlight some novel ways that fanfiction interfaces with its parent works and show the unique features of the enterprise. Hopefully, this approach is well suited to justifying the existence of fanfiction as its own distinct thing rather than just trying to fold it into the standards of original fiction, though I'll also have to begrudgingly do that as, like I said, this is all in pursuit of beating a bunch of League of Legends players whose closest contact to literature is the bi-weekly patch notes dump, and who are so addicted to rank that they gotta win every conversation they're in like it's some sort of game. Thus, this video is half a love letter to what makes fanfiction unique and valuable in today's media landscape, and half an argument as to why reading fanfiction is just as good a use of your time as reading basically any other fiction. There's also significant time spent on leveraging specific fanfictions throughout these component arguments, as I want to keep my points concrete. It's very easy to list the simple perks of the medium, but without examples, it's difficult to demonstrate the modality by which these benefits are conveyed to the reader, and why fanfiction is unique in its ability to show these benefits. Also, all of these stories I mentioned are certified bangers, so if this inspires you to seek out these particular fics, then I have done my job well. We'll scale up the complexity of arguments as we go along, but it's important to note that nothing I say exists in a vacuum. Part of the beauty of fanfiction is that it exists in constant discourse with itself, its sources, and the creators and audience, so expect there to be a lot of layering different virtues of fanfiction to create something resembling a coherent argument. You guys have seen the video runtime though. Ugh, I am so sorry. Context first. School Rumble is a manga/anime created by Jin Kobayashi that... Wait. Pause. Is that a franchise? Like, is a manga or light novel with an anime adaptation enough to qualify it as a multimedia franchise? It just sounds so wrong, but whatever, let's actually roll with it. School Rumble is a franchise that centers around the exploits of Tsukamoto Tenma and Haruma Kenji as two parts of a sprawling love polygon that eventually encompasses, like, their entire high school? Haruma is madly in love with Tenma, who's madly in love with another classmate, etc., etc., but both are complete idiots, with Tenma being oblivious to Haruma's advances and seeing him as a confused delinquent, which, to be fair, is a decent characterization of him, and Haruma is constantly blind to the futility of his romantic gestures and ignorant of the few crushes he himself inspires throughout the course of the manga. The series is a romantic comedy that is supposed to be a send-up of tropes in the genre, but it kind of does that thing that bad parodies do, where it thinks that by just being really maximalist all the time, that it's doing all it needs to do to be counted as a parody. I mean, come on, what the hell is this supposed to be satirizing? Oh yeah, this really hits all those overplayed Ripped Sea Captain is actually a secret mangaka who hides his nib holder inside of a giant tuna plot points. It's basically this generation's Hot Springs episode. Anyway, while it doesn't really work as a parody, School Rumble is still a really fun read or watch due to the fact that it's so willing to wade into the absurd, but it has stuck with me for years not because of that fact, but instead because Jin Kobayashi is so willing to space out his set pieces with stunning moments of pathos and quiet introspection. At its best, it's an encapsulation of what being a high schooler feels like, leveraging its heightened set pieces to cut to the feelings run haywire that at the very least informed that era for me, where everything felt so damn important. Then the ending happened. Haruma jumps out of a plane that was trying to take him to Africa, parachuting down on top of a large mountain, where he is ostracized from the rest of Class 2C. In his rage, he becomes a gigantic gorilla, and it turns out the Kurosama Oji has some kind of weird space Alzheimer's that causes him to try to talk Haruma down everything that has happened in the series. He's secretly been harboring feelings for Tenma this entire time, so has remained standoffish specifically because he does not want to himself by going to go live with
Anteaters!
I don't use the term complete disaster lightly, but man. So, the deal with a love triangle romance dynamic is that inherently, someone is going to find themselves with the short end of the stick, unless you take the base pro-ZD method, I guess.
Why don't we all just fuck each other?
Actually, quick tangent. Jin, if you really wanted to have Skull Rumble be a parody, you should have had the Class 2C polycule be a thing. That subversion would have gone so hard, you could have at least put it into Skull Rumble Z, you know? And I mean, there's still time, Jin! There's still time! I saw the special chapters you made. The canon is malleable! Oh, also, while you're here, could you please get Ichiro Heian a Western release? Thank you. Anyways, the short sick recipient for the love triangle that the rest of the series' relationships revolve around is in fact Haruma, who frankly never even has a shot at having Tenma reciprocate his feelings. While how Tenma and her love interest, Karasuma, are left off is an entirely different can of massive, writhing worms that have penetrated deep into my mind slime, I'll pretend like all that is fine and focus most upon Haruma and who he ended up with, Sawachika Eri. Eri is one of Tenma's gal pals alongside Suo Mikoto and Takano Akira, and exists to be a rich girl for the group. She's one of the first characters, though, to really gain a solid subplot that explores her emotional complexities and the social pressures that cause them, and I'm actually broadly happy with her arc throughout the series. She and Haruma grow closer through, well, say it with me now, wacky misunderstandings that could easily be solved with one fucking conversation if these characters weren't as well socialized as slime molds, but eventually Eri does develop genuine feelings for Haruma. Haruma, on the other hand, isn't really allowed by the boundaries of Jin Kobayashi's narrative to fall in love with anyone besides Tenma because of how tied his arc is to how he relates to his unrequited love. Haruma's development shows when his newfound empathy and respect for others overrides his once selfish unrequited love for Tenma. It's why he is the one to take Tenma to the airport and ultimately to Kurasama near the series' conclusion. This gesture just wouldn't have the same impact if by this point Haruma had fallen out of love with Tenma in favor of Eri. At that point, it'd just be like giving a ride to a close friend. Regardless, the climax of the relationship between Haruma and Eri, which comes hot on the heels of Haruma sending Tenma to America, is Haruma agreeing to an arranged marriage with her in order to satisfy the demands of the Sawachika family. Now, I promise, this makes sense in context. I think that given the ordering of these events, that it would be possible to see Haruma reevaluate his feelings for Eri after realizing that Tenma is destined to love Kurasama forever, though. Honestly, if we got an extra arc in between Tenma leaving and Eri's arranged marriage, it'd be possible for Haruma to recover from his heartbreak over Tenma and slowly come to feel deeper for Eri, especially because the manga has quite the time skip leading up to its last few chapters. However, Jin Kobayashi did not want to tell this story, and perhaps more damningly, it felt like he didn't even want the characters to develop any further. This is where the disaster comes in. The last 4 pages of the mainline manga have Haruma clinging onto the vain hope that Tenma will confess to him. What's worse is that it's a hope born from the same level of delusion that informed Haruma's actions super early in School Rumble. We are talking full-on rose goggles where Haruma imagines that a confession is coming because Tenma is happy that he showed up to a planned class reunion, one that Eri was definitely going to be at and would therefore probably drag him along to. It just reeks of short-sightedness, both on Haruma and Jin Kobayashi's ends, because we have to accept that at least a portion of the characters in the story are put into arrested development for a long time if we are to accept this ending. This final chapter takes place at least 3 years after Haruma and Sawachika agreed to marry by my calculations. Notably, these are 3 long years with Tenma and Haruma having 0 direct contact with one another. If in this time of separation, Haruma refuses to let go of her, with him in fact backsliding into believing that Tenma could still possibly fall for him, how in the world can we ever read his marriage to Eri as ever working out or being a happy one? I guess there's interesting space here for some sort of mature downer ending where Jin Kobayashi just lets Haruma live with these feelings. If he's going to continue his unrequited love by virtue of his own stubbornness, which, to be fair, is an incredibly well-established aspect of his character, then fine, he brought this life onto himself, where he will have to navigate these feelings as he is forced ever closer to Eri, who doubtlessly will hold onto her love just like Haruma is doing with his. Of course, Jin Kobayashi closes the door on the speculation though by virtually confirming a happy marriage between Eri and Haruma in the future as they end up having a kid together, and just look at how happy they are. I don't think that Eri's expression here really indicates that this was done solely out of obligation to her family to produce an heir or something distasteful like that. So, School Rumble leaves us with Haruma and Eri caught between 2 worlds. Jin Kobayashi wants to have his cake and eat it too, and therefore he pulls for them to end up happily together, but does 0 of the work necessary to actually detach Haruma from Tenma, and therefore allow space to explore his feelings towards the person he will eventually father a child with. This is particularly salient given the extremely accelerated timeline he puts us on by virtue of there being 3 years in which Haruma does not develop at all. I hope I have impressed upon you that I truly do view this ending as genuinely flawed, rather than just not being what I expected or wanted out of the series. I'm also pretty sure that this is a widely held view. While it's not the most popular romantic comedy manga, I've encountered enough people in my time on the internet that I can pretty confidently say that the ending is almost universally disliked, even among people who ship Eri and Haruma, which I must note is also a minority. Now that I think of it, this might actually be a really good illustration of the manga's failings. I know exactly 2 people who shipped Haruma and Eri, and neither of them enjoyed the ending, by the way. But the overwhelming majority shipped Haruma with either Tenma or, more commonly, her little sister Yakumo due to another subplot we simply do not have the time to discuss. Ultimately, it just never felt like School Rumble justified the relationship between Eri and Haruma progressing beyond the bonds shared by close friends, and therefore the ending felt even more like a total blindside. Perhaps if Jin Kobayashi had the willpower to write another 50 chapters that extend into the time skip and also burn the manuscript for the unfortunate final chapter, we could all find ourselves on Team Arima, but no such luck. There's a hole in the canon instead, one that we can turn and have to turn to fanfiction to fill. Enter, on that front, Third Year Rumble. As a fanfiction, Third Year Rumble's greatest accomplishment is in how it draws its character arcs from the spirit of its parent work. In doing maintenance to an existing canon and being very explicit that it is being written to address flaws with its source materials, its respect for what makes School Rumble great and the smoothness with which it uses the manga as a springboard is crucial to keeping readers engaged. Like the best parts of School Rumble, its author Amity33 uses the intensity of the characters' emotions to centralize all of the wild plot points on the core, relatable experience of being in high school. Moments of passion and vulnerability that were so needed to explain how Haruma and Eri grow together are given space in this medium that couldn't justifiably happen in the source material unless, as I said, we had another 50 chapters or so to play with. This starts from the opening paragraphs of the story, with Sawachika bringing Haruma to a party she is obligated to attend by her family. We immediately get a continuation of Haruma's discomfort with wealth, particularly in its most garish and superficial forms. We'd seen this in previous visits to the Sawachika household, and it's a breath of fresh air for these subtler themes to return after the madness of the canon's ending arc. For Haruma, the past weeks shown as the manga's concluding chapters have been a whirlwind of fury within and without. He's been, in the past 2-3 weeks, on the receiving end of physical attacks on at least 4 occasions, seen Tenma off to America, agreed to a sham marriage, moved houses, and learned that his rival in love has super amnesia. Now, thrusted into an unfamiliar space filled with the kind of people he has despised for years, Amity 33 smartly brings forth his need for solace in that moment, connecting it back to his seeming flights of fancy that would crop up across the storylines in the manga as he'd ride his motorcycle across Japan, or take up a job as a fisherman, or live with a strange lady in her apartment for several weeks. Rebuffing the advances of social climbers looking to make an example of him, and confronted with the true weight of Eri's obligations as an unwilling participant in this world of the rich, Haruma finds himself, for maybe the first time, seeking her out to confide directly in her. Eri does the same, and is seeking respite from her own distressing encounters at that event. In that moment, Third Year Rumble shifts from the often random encounters that define the relationship of this pair in School Rumble to something mutual and controlled by the characters themselves. Amity 33 knew that the type of storytelling that Jin Kobayashi had used to buoy the ultimately cyclical nature of School Rumble would not work to align the canon with the reality of how his characters were oriented in it, and so they, at the first possible moment, shifted the way the plot functions as the first of its many fixes to School Rumble. As Third Year Rumble lives up to its name and plays out through our protagonist's third and final year at Yagami High School, it cleverly uses its structure to echo the events of School Rumble in a similar mode to the events at the party. The original manga documents a bit more than a year's span by touching upon fixed events and moments in a school year, and Third Year Rumble mimics this. As we follow the cast through another cultural festival, beach trip at summer vacation, and athletics fair, it's clear just how much things have changed from Jin Kobayashi's incarnation in regards to character arcs. There's evolution that is wonderfully amplified by the tone of Third Year Rumble, something that hasn't changed from School Rumble. It's transposed from the parent work. Every thought of romance similarly jumps off the page and burns furiously with a passion only a high schooler could muster, but for once, they are thoughts considerate of the others in the story. They're less single-minded and more overwrought with fear of ruining what characters already have with one another. Haruma, in particular, is less of an overactor and more of an overthinker now, and in the process of developing him in this way, Amity 33 lets the reader in on a vibrant inner world that really brings out the caring aspects of his person that were collapsed for comedic effect in the original series. It feels like a bit of a disservice, though, to play-by-play any more of Third Year Rumble, partly because I urge anyone who's a fan of School Rumble to read it, but also because that's where my gripes with the work come to the forefront, and I think it's pretty clear that I cannot stop myself from mentioning any gripes that I have about anything. Simultaneously, though, the moments that come out in the play-by-play are just not as important when one zooms out on Third Year Rumble's purpose as professed by Amity 33. It's really more of a forum for characters to have the conversations they deserve to have in the mainline series. I don't remember who wins the third year athletics fair, or why Haruma ends up hospitalized due to some kind of family plot in Third Year Rumble. But what does stick with me are the quiet moments shared between Haruma and Eri at the first party she drags him off to, or the tormented private reflections that both of them experienced when separated as they navigate their own tumultuous internal world so lovingly rendered by Amity 33. In the same way that Third Year Rumble started off with an eye for detail exacting enough to carry on from the very moment of the final panel from chapter 281, its treatment of these inner worlds of these characters also makes me confident that the trajectory of their arcs mesh almost exactly with where Jin Kobayashi wanted to have them end up, even if he couldn't pull it off himself. It's so teeth-clenchingly obvious that Haruma in the original series just needs to get over himself, over Tenma, and grow the fuck up. And frankly, it's so palpable that late into the series, you just kind of want to reach through the screen or pages and shake the guy to wakefulness. My theory, though, is that Jin Kobayashi feared losing the basis for the manga's comedic elements if Haruma moved on. And so while everything changed around and often inside of him, this one element of his character where he would just not give up on Tenma persisted against all odds and plot points that would demand the contrary. Third Year Rumble's unlocking of Haruma's character development is composed of hundreds of thousands of carefully chosen words on the author's part. Amity 33's mature eye towards the multiple facets of what love entails, socially, emotionally, and yeah, sexually, was exceptionally necessary to not only bring progression to Eri and Haruma's relationship, but also to disentangle the mess that Jin Kobayashi left them and us with. My understanding of how Third Year Rumble weaves itself into the canon of School Rumble is such that even without directly going back to the fanfiction itself, I can't look back on the canon material without seeing it in dialogue with Third Year Rumble. Frankly, at this point I don't think I would have it any other way though. This is actually the reward for engaging with Third Year Rumble or whatever other fanfiction. It's finding yourself content with the story you have devoted your love and time to, free from the misgivings that can gnaw in the back of the minds of especially dedicated fans when a story fails them. There's a joy to looking back upon an ending that once left me deeply dissatisfied with a newfound adoration for its characters and the stories told through them. Here in School Rumble Z, I now really do love how Haruma and Eri look. Eri's smile radiates with a love that is finally free from complications, and Haruma is definitely complaining about deadlines for his manga that he has to reach, but he seems so well lived in these more put together clothes, doubtlessly supplied to him by Sawachika's fortune. His blush betrays all of his posturing, and he will follow Eri to the ends of the earth. While he still bristles at being recognized for his achievements, he is proud of the life he has made alongside her, one that the two of them can live out alongside the friends that they hold so dear. Am I giving both Amity 33 and Jin Kobayashi too much credit? I've basically employed varying degrees of cherry picking to cope my way into a healthy relationship with School Rumble, which no longer is the same School Rumble that exists for most people. I've basically said to hell with the canon, or even fanfiction as they are written, to just greedily draw from whatever sources to make these amalgamations of characters sit right in the mind. The Haruma Kenji and Sawachika Eri that I know and claim to now understand are different from the Haruma and Eri found in School Rumble and the minds of everyone else who has engaged with the series. Even other people who have read Third Year Rumble will have latched onto different versions and elements of their relationships and arcs than I did. In research for this video, I revisited the work, and as I said before, I was surprised at how many details I had completely forgotten or ignored outright. Honestly, some of it was probably for the best too. There's like a lot of sexy stuff in there, and not all of it is written very well. At the same time though, isn't this how we should all engage with media? Characters and places capture our imagination, and it's hard to not picture these things that we care about living beyond the boundaries of their stories, canon or fanon. We might not take all of these ideas and make fanfiction out of them, but we all understand the impulse, and we internalize the imaginaries that we create, at least to some degree, and furthermore, we reject some of the canon that we don't agree with. If you've ever wondered what your favorite character's favorite food is, or what they do in the time between chapters or episodes or scenes, then they are not only the characters of the source fiction's author. You have contributed to the thing you love. And so what if my vision of Sawachika and Haruma isn't dictated by just Jin Kobayashi? It never was. As soon as I read School Rumble, Sawachika and Haruma and Tenma and Yakumo and Suo and Hanai and Akira and everybody else became my characters too, at least in part. It's why I can chat with my brother over if Suo had always liked Hanai or if Layla had feelings for Ichijo, which she totally did by the way, because for him, they are also his characters as well as Jin Kobayashi's. For me, they're also Amity 33's characters and tens of other writers whose ideas I opened the door to, or at least had to wiggle through the gaps. The Overwatch canon is needlessly complicated for teasing tons but not saying a whole lot, and we'll get to why that is the case in a bit. However, for what you actually need to know about the canon right now so we could get our bearings in this section, we'll start with the history of the organization known as Overwatch. It was a United Nations-backed military strike team that was formed in order to fight during what is known as the Omnic Crisis. It's mostly just your run-of-the-mill AI uprising, and while it has some interesting bits, those are not bits that we are going to have to access here. For the most part, Overwatch does a good job of quelling this crisis, but they then find themselves thrust into a world that eventually finds themselves grappling with the role as an international agency that answers to very few during a time in which countries are trying to regain sovereignty. It's not a great pairing, and a few occasions of massive overreach by Overwatch, and particularly their covert operations division Blackwatch, brings immense pressure upon them from the UN, and eventually they are shut down. This creates a power vacuum that empowers Talon and other clandestine groups with similarly sinister names to just kind of explode in popularity and power, and after 6 years of inactivity, mounting threats inspire former Overwatch members to initiate recall, defying international rulings in order to reform. Hey, are Overwatch even the good guys? Like, I know they're up against a bunch of supervillain groups that sound a lot more evil, but they're a group that by all rights were deservedly shut down due to their meddling in affairs they weren't supposed to have jurisdiction over. Blackwatch's hiring practices also deserve some sharp looks too, given the fact that they were picking up the likes of Miss Walking Bag of War Crimes and Mr. Yakuza. There's something about a group of supposedly exceptional individuals bucking international law to impose their vision through military force that smacks of... I don't know. All I'm saying is that I wonder if Winston ever read The Fountainhead or something. The canon kind of drops off of a cliff post-recall, and while there are events on the timeline that take place past this spot that could help us possibly navigate these murky waters, they're mostly just action set pieces so inconsequential to the canon that there's not even consensus to which order they occur in. Of course, I'd love for the creators of the canon to eventually progress the plot of Overwatch to where they can start to talk about the casting of Overwatch as heroes as maybe not a given, or hell, just dive into some of these heroes to begin with. However, given that they can't even stick the landing to play for the most common of denominators in delivering a story mode that has been promised for years, I think that the burden once again falls to us, the fans that love the characters that Blizzard introduced, and who actually care about these goobers as more than just vectors for selling cosmetics that for some reason you have to spend money on just to gain the privilege of grinding the game to unlock. God, I hate battle passes. And so, what is the reason for Overwatch's lore to be caught out in suspended animation like this? This just simply isn't compelling storytelling. You can't just throw a bunch of ideas at a wall and then say that things happen without actually showing or rendering those events with any care whatsoever. Well, the answer is, of course, fucking money, because it always is. That's why battle passes also exist, goddammit. But yes, make no mistake, at the end of the day, the death of the lore's forward progression is entirely a corporate rather than artistic decision. The people who went about crafting the world of Overwatch and the characters that inhabit it clearly put what love and care that they could into it. There's many small touches that hint at a bigger picture and grander themes throughout, and I want to make sure that I am not downplaying their contributions, as it is their work that drew so many of us to the game to begin with. However, the needs of a live service video game are not the same as the needs of a compelling narrative. While the latter wants plot developments that impress themselves deeply upon the setting and characters, the former wants little more than a toy box that their characters can perpetually fight in until the end of time, and that's exactly what Overwatch finds itself in, a toy box held in suspended animation. There are conflicts to be had, but no resolutions in sight. This toy box style of world building stymies so many elements of fiction, and you would imagine that there has to be some kind of way to answer back against it outside of fanfiction, but there really isn't. Even things that you would imagine wouldn't require a huge overarching plot in order to effectively convey basically fall by the wayside within this toy box style of world building. Without having to spend time doing anything as gauche as writing a compelling arc, you'd hope that Blizzard could have at least gone all out with creating rich lives for each and every one of their cast members and posting it as videos or lists or basically anything, but the fact of the matter is, characterization isn't done well in a vacuum. Going back through the Overwatch canon in order to write this script, I was shocked by how many details of each character that I thought were fleshed out by Blizzard actually only exist within the realm of fanfiction that, very similar to my conception of the Skull Rumble canon, are put there because I read so much fanfiction. In retrospect, this makes sense. There's maybe 50 comics and short story chapters plus a few cinematics, which in totality comprise the Overwatch canon, and most of those average about 8 pages or 2,000 words. There's just simply not enough room to delve into a character's idiosyncrasies, particularly when you have to go through all the 38 plus heroes that currently exist in the game. Without fanfiction, there's something deeply nihilistic about the trajectory of a property like Overwatch. All extra work done to the setting beyond its initial setup has to be done in a way that's monetizable, specifically more monetizable than whatever else a franchise's creative staff could be directed to put their effort towards, lest it be swept away in a capitalist tide of efficiency. The best case scenario is that the universe will persist for another decade or more in our world, but we can tell from the past 8 years that the game has been out that we aren't ever really going to get any real forward movement. It'll expand laterally for sure, adding more characters that'll remain untouched and undeveloped after their launch until the player base dries up. When that ultimately and unavoidably does come to pass, we'll be given a few community posts, but little closure. It's just not efficient for a company to dwell. Maybe down the line a staff writer will put out a Twitter thread about how things were meant to turn out for the characters and world, and then that'll be it. A universe already built from characters and suspended animation will die and find itself in a massive constellation of other dead worlds. There is no canon end to Spellbreak or Mega Strikers or Team Fortress 2 or Battleborn or Anthem or Evolve, and there won't be one for League of Legends or Genshin Impact or Overwatch or whatever other game you love that operates on this model. All that we can do is build our own endings. I'll show you guys at least one example of how beautifully this can be done, but recognize that this is a trend that exists across the medium. You'll have to find your own endings for the things you love. I think it's probably best that I'm an open book for this project, or I guess more thematically, an open AO3 page with some very sus tags. So here we go, behind the curtain for one of my favorite ships for an example. The artist Cryonidae on Twitter contributed one of the best encapsulations of my favorite ship's dynamic a few years ago with this illustration, and I don't think that there's a better introduction to Junk Metra, or Simrat. Not sure which is better, although the Discord community goes by Simrats. Yeah, there is a Discord server for this very specific rare pair ship, but is that really a surprise in this day and age? Just in general, it is the ultimate opposites attract kind of ship within the realm of Overwatch, and I think this says a lot about me, honestly. Perhaps I'm just looking to attract someone that's socially well-adjusted, looks good, and is happy with their life. But ultimately, this is a pairing that really does draw a very devout following. I wouldn't say that Simrat is a very popular ship. It's definitely nowhere near the likes of Pharah and Mercy, Reaper and Soldier 76, or Hanzo and Cassidy, but it still has at least 3 of the most highly regarded non-crossover Overwatch fanfictions in its ranks. While I strongly recommend checking out Your Body as a Weapon and Breakout, I want to focus in on the longest and most well-known of the bunch, Quiet Pastel Colors' You Touch Me and I Burn. As always though, a bit more background before we can get started. Sorry this is becoming a running trend. Junkrat is one of several characters featured in the game that are classified as Junkers, a group of Australians with ties to the irradiated wasteland that much of the continent has become in the modern day of the lore. Following the end of the Omnic Crisis, the Australian government gave away significant portions of land in the center of the country to surviving Omnics, the artificially intelligent robots whose predecessors had rebelled against mankind. This included giving away the Omnium, a massive manufacturing facility in the Outback capable of producing new Omnics. While this helped to further peaceful relations between much of humanity and the Omnics, it came at the cost of displacing what current population there was that lived in Central Australia, and in turn, those people formed the paramilitary Australian Liberation Front in order to fight back against what basically amounts to straight-up colonization. Their efforts culminated in a strike upon the Omnium itself, which went about as well as you would expect an untrained malicious attack on a volatile, nuclear-powered facility would go. The Omnium eventually blew up, annihilating any chance at a return to a normal way of life for the Outback's residents, Omnic or human. Junkrat, real name Jameson Fox, was either a child or in his early teens when he was thrust into this new world, and by all the lore we currently have, he braved the wasteland as a youth pretty much alone. He had no control over the actions of Australia, the ALF, the Omnics, and in that light, it's understandable that he came to be the criminal that we see in-game. Everything has failed him. The world has been ruined. While he eventually meets up with Roadhog and finds the resources to go on an international crime spree, even assuming that he's well and truly found fulfillment with his new life, you can't really undo the massive trauma that doubtlessly runs beneath the surface of his character. Importantly, the pain of a dead or gone family and the innumerable horrors that comprise the setting of Junkrat's early life fit in line with the authorial vision of Overwatch's world building, surprisingly enough. The game at some point clearly wanted its world to be important, which is the only reason I can imagine its backstory is chock full of allusions to racism, colonialism, mutually assured destruction, and the nature of heroism when said heroes are forced to defy the powers that be and may not all come from the classic hero stock. We are still waiting for the canon to delve into any of these themes or to bring to justice Junkrat's character and the depth that his origin suggests, though. For now, he remains trapped in limbo as a goofy comedic relief hero who eats his own toenails. While Junkrat is explicitly themed around chaos to the point that the character is flattened into little besides a disaster gremlin in-game, Satya Symmetra Vaswani's life is inextricably linked to order. Plucked from poverty in Hyderabad by the monolithic Vishkar Corporation, which is like if you took Northrop Grumman, Disney, and BlackRock and rolled it all into one, Symmetra was trained in the manipulation of hardlight, a technology controlled by Vishkar that the company used to rebuild and bring in line much of India following the Omnic crisis. As a foremost expert in hardlight known as an architect, Symmetra was instrumental in the construction of Utopia, a city entirely controlled by Vishkar that you really couldn't have given a more on-the-nose name if you tried. What followed the completion of this base of operations for the company was a vision to expand outwards, and Symmetra was selected to undergo training to help covertly shore up Vishkar's interests. Now armed with abilities in espionage and subterfuge, she is sent on international missions to ensure that Vishkar gains influence in the countless projects of rebuilding that exist globally following the Omnic crisis. Oh, also she's autistic. You might think that that'd be a really important thing to mention given how proud Blizzard is to have someone with autism in their game, but the official lore has devoted maybe a total of 200 words across all voice lines, comics, short stories, and official bios to this fact, so there's not really a whole lot in the lore that we can point to that really demonstrates the qualia of autism that Symmetra experiences. Well, turns out that it's very hard to convey the impact of autism, a disorder that is often tied to how an individual approaches communication and interpersonal interaction when you don't have the space for characters to interact on their own terms. And so, therefore, we enter into You Touch Me and I Burn with two characters with unexplored depths made to explore each other. As part of Recall, Winston has expanded Overwatch's recruitment to include Junkrat and his companion Roadhog, as they have proven their demolition and crowd control abilities during their global heist. In exchange for their cooperation and reformation, Overwatch would pay them handsomely and shield them from the authorities, given that the organization is now operating in defiance of international laws themselves. Simultaneously, Vishkar sends Symmetra to act as a liaison between Overwatch and the company, as they're interested in monitoring the team and their possible impact on Vishkar's interests. By virtue of both being builders or engineers of sorts, Junkrat and Symmetra are forced to share a workshop within the Gibraltar Overwatch campus, and this inevitably leads to conflict as Symmetra's orderly approach to her work is frequently interrupted by Junkrat's free-spirited approach to keeping the workshop neat. As scene setting for a story that is nearly the length of the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy combined, this really doesn't seem like a lot to go off of. Yes, plot developments do eventually bring more action and drama to the table, but things only really get started about 150,000 words in, which is basically the same thing as saying that mountaineering only really gets good once you start climbing K2. Yet, I actually think this sort of lethargic start is the exact antidote for the state that Blizzard has left Overwatch's lore in. With lore releases only deemed necessary when they're tied to new content, the little progression that we do get on the timeline, like I mentioned earlier, is all jumbled together around action set pieces. We have the Battle of Rio, the Battle of Toronto, the Battle of Gothenburg, the fights at Ilios, Paris Route 66, etc., all of which the community dedicated enough to update the wiki about cannot even place exactly on the timeline. There's no space for downtime, no time for quiet moments in this schedule. Quiet Pastel Colors is an author that is clearly capable of writing compelling moments of action and intrigue. This is something that they demonstrate in later chapters as Overwatch becomes entangled with trying to extract Symmetra from the grip of Vishkar, but they understand the virtue in letting the setting and characters breathe. There are no quotas to meet or deadlines to hit when writing fanfiction, though please for the love of God finish this fic, it is so close to being done, it is so good. And so it is the prime medium to just have Symmetra and Junkrat bum around Watchpoint Gibraltar for the time that must realistically come from in between missions. And what an antidote to the issues of lore in live service games too. A slow burn like this allows for some of my very favorite moments in storytelling on par with many published novels. We actually get a focus upon Symmetra's autism as she navigates the social mores of Overwatch, which is at its core a tight-knit group of wildly varying people, a significant number of whom have known each other for 20 plus years, basically the optimal nightmare scenario for people with autism to try to enter into. The sense of alienation that she feels, even as Anna, Mercy, and others try to welcome her into the fold, is so familiar to autistic people, but so is her gradual adaptation, appreciation for the accommodations, and growing care for her newfound family. It's really beautiful in a way. Quiet Pastel Colors understands that taking too much time away from Symmetra's mind could disrupt our ability to track the process of self-reflection that allows for her evolution. It is the reason why, as an author, they are so intent upon keeping things slow for as long as they do. Furthermore, spending time watching the process of Symmetra opening up to not only Junkrat but the whole cast is sort of the point. There's of course going to be gratification from hearing how someone with a condition like autism finds herself not only acceptance of, but appreciation for her perspective, but it's another thing entirely to actually be there for a type of character progression that, yeah, might need a few tens of thousand words directed to it rather than several bullet points. Junkrat also thrives with more time focused upon his character. The implications of his upbringing or lack thereof in the Outback is finally allowed to go beyond the visible, conveyable elements that slot nicely into a multiplayer shooter. A brilliant turn of his character introduced early in You Touch Me and I Burn is the fact that Junkrat cannot read. It's something that can only have been played for laughs in the sort of interactions the character is allowed to have in the canon, but here, it is just treated so damn tenderly. Just like Symmetra's autism, Junkrat's illiteracy is forced to exist in discourse with other people and other elements of his character in a way that a toy box narrative sidesteps, as things here must move forward and characters must continue to relate to and against one another. His reaction of embarrassment when Symmetra asks him about his inability to read is quite natural, and Quiet Pastel Colors could have left that little nugget of world building there, but it's what follows that initial shock of embarrassment that tells us so much more about Junkrat. He protests repeatedly that being illiterate doesn't make him stupid, at points almost begging Symmetra to see his intellect as worth being considered, for her to see him as an equal. It was his wits that enabled him to survive in the Wasteland. His brilliance allowed for him to survive in spite of his competition being those far physically stronger than him, in spite of losing an arm and a leg. It makes sense that he'd prize his intelligence, but it's also important to note his reaction in discourse with his alienation from others. Symmetra's attempts to regulate his behavior in and out of the workshop has already jeopardized his sense of control, and there's such a desperation to his conversation to have her see him as an equal in intelligence, its insecurity entangled with his masculine pride, his coveting of control in a life so deprived of it, and so much more. It's marvelous how much is brought forth with this one revelation and interaction. In this moment of him showing weakness, Symmetra offers to teach him as she feels obligated to her workshop partner to help Junkrat learn to read. It is one of the first of many bridges built between such flawed characters, viewing themselves as broken due to their minds and bodies, finding comfort and redemption through one another. It's something that I can honestly describe as beautiful, transcendental of the medium of fanfiction. This is one of the pieces I go back to when I think about disability, when I think about problems in continuity with the people I relate myself to. You can put down that Junkrat is uneducated and Symmetra is autistic in their character bios and ship that to live servers, but to truly live either of those characteristics is an experience denied to those who follow Overwatch lore and care for its characters by the canon. You Touch Me and I Burn is one of hundreds of attempts by Overwatch fans to push back against the limitations imposed on characters meant to embody full people and all that entails. It is the only place where characters like these can have their inner worlds rendered to an audience. Fanfiction not only builds up these characters through this sort of exploration, though. In some cases, it works as crucial maintenance to a character that is contorted to suit the needs of a franchise that may only care for consistency in its story as an afterthought. Something that never sat right with me that You Touch Me and I Burn has fixed is how Symmetra's characterization in the scant lore we do have is destabilized by the creative direction that has been alluded to by the game's developers. Across the course of about a year prior to Overwatch's release, Blizzard team members Chris Metzen and Michael Chu both separately confirmed that Symmetra was operating as a part of Overwatch with ulterior motives, as per Metzen's comments at a panel at BlizzCon, and that she's perceived as villainous by some characters in the canon, as told by Chu in a Reddit AMA. I know that an offhanded comment at BlizzCon or a Reddit AMA thread probably isn't the best source for lore, but also at the same time, there's just not that much out there for any of the Overwatch casts, so therefore, this is still considered canon by many people in the community. It's still on the wiki, and this is often the motivating factor for darker Symmetra storylines in the realm of fanfiction. I understand the arguments as to why these should be viewed as canon, but to me, these claims seem to fly in the face of how Symmetra is depicted in other aspects of the canon, including her spotlight comic, A Better World. It's frustrating that we even have these disputes to begin with. Overwatch is just frankly too flippant in how they orient their characters to suit whatever narrative they want to try to push out there, rather than looking for a cohesive vision for what Symmetra should be and can be. In A Better World, during her clandestine work in Rio, she is privy to Vishkar's ruthlessness as they bomb the headquarters of a rival company that still had employees inside, and from that point onwards, she seems to have had her faith shaken in the company that dominated her entire life. The short story Stone by Stone, which takes place after A Better World, also shows this. as she talks to the wise Zenyatta about Vishkar's mission to ostensibly bring opportunity and equality to disenfranchised groups through their technology. Her words are overlaid by thoughts of the company's hypocrisy, with her ambitions to pepper the skyline with luxury high-rises and cushy offices. In discourse with this, You Touch Me and I Burn is willing to do away with some elements of Symmetra and Junkrat's canon characterization when it best suits not only the plot, but the characters themselves. You could argue that You Touch Me and I Burn doesn't even contravene the statements of Metzen and Chu. They're so vague that you can really contort some crazy conclusions from their points, and so therefore maybe this is all for naught anyway. Michael, what the hell do you mean that she could be viewed as a villain by individuals in the setting? Someone's hero is another person's villain, almost invariably so when they've done as much random shit as a character in the Overwatch setting. Hell, Reaper's list of villains probably includes every person with a positive outlook on life. Let's give them the most direct interpretation of their statements, though. Symmetra is most certainly not a villainous character in this fanfiction, and it's hard to even see her as having ulterior motives. She's definitely in a position where she could implement any number of devious schemes, but the thought of betraying her compatriots at Overwatch, who we are going to continue to view as the good guys, if only for my own sanity, doesn't even cross her mind. She's feeding information back to Vishkar at first, yes, but it's all above the board and she's explicitly permitted to do so by the organization. You can almost say that the story touches this segment of Symmetra's character and burns it. Okay, I will not do that again. I bring this up because it's a good distillation of what ought to be the praxis of fanworks when engaging with the canon of a franchise like Overwatch. I could not give less of a shit about the notion of someone acting out of character when so little is done by the original creators to actually flesh things out to begin with. Yes, you can argue that Symmetra having something sinister brewing is canon, I guess, but that doesn't make it law. Certainly not when I can engage with a story crafted by someone who earnestly loves the character and does the legwork to create a new conception of them that goes above and beyond anything written by Blizzard's staff. Hitchens' razor is a logic tool that states that which is stated without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Here, we can translate this as canon characterization can be undone in a fanwork if effort proportional to how that characterization was initially conveyed is done. I know I've talked at length about Overwatch in this chapter, but what's so exciting about fanfiction is how universalizable its benefits to this sort of storytelling is. Live service games, multiverse-styled franchises, all of the books that saw the success of Game of Thrones and thought, hey, I want me a piece of that, all share the common traits that I've rattled on about with Overwatch. If it has a wide group of characters with very distinct traits so that they can be immediately recognized as we can't spend much time on any individual, an expansive world with plenty of scaffolding but nothing delving into the nitty-gritty of the timeline's big swings, or plenty of plot hooks that have yet to and may never come together, then there's countless stories to be told. Even the more traditional modes of storytelling can still find themselves in situations of all setting, no story, or at least all setting, severely hamstrung or interrupted story through a variety of means. There are several franchises deeply rooted in the public consciousness that may never see their endings penned in our lifetimes. Hunter x Hunter, the Parable series, Vagabond, High School of the Dead, fucking Game of Thrones, through death, hiatus, or development hell, it might just be up to us. I've basically accepted at this point that the action manga Black Lagoon by Rei Hiroe is probably going to go dark far before we get a satisfying ending. Hiroe is an artist with a unique eye towards action and dark characterization, but he also has a unique tendency to just not fucking finish any of his manga that run more than 10 chapters. By contrast, the Black Lagoon fanfiction called, and please stick with me for this, The Redneck of Roanapur by Big Country 75 is an almost 300,000 word story that contains fulfilling arcs for basically every consequential character in the series, plenty of lore-compliant developments that feel as organic as anything Hiroe ever penned, and an ending that I'd struggle to make more complete. Yeah, it does dip its toe into an unrealistic level of wish fulfillment, and its opening chapters go by with such speed that it has some beloved characters go fully out of character for a bit, but I'll take that any day over the 25 chapters in 9 years that we've gotten from Hiroe. It's not like original properties are immune to bad writing or rushed plot points anyways, and you also know my tendency to just cut out things I don't like from my headcanon. The Wired Red wildcard arc of Black Lagoon that has occupied the vast majority of the manga's runtime since the anime ended is generally considered to be its weakest yet, with people complaining of, guess what, bad pacing and characters acting inconsistently. And while things have looked up in recent chapters and Hiroe has in fact increased their publication speed yet again, I still think that Redneck of Roanoper is going to remain my headcanon ending for the entirety of the series. I've probably dwelled on all of this for far too long, and for that I am sorry. This is the trend in modern storytelling that I hate the most, though. Mostly because it's an issue that shouldn't have to exist. I think that most people would be happy if we decouple games like Overwatch from the stories that they tell. I think it'd be fantastic if we just pay people to expand the world and draw more people into it. Doubtlessly, I think that more people would engage with Overwatch if these characters were constantly upkept, that we actually got depth for Symmetra and Junkrat and everybody else in this wild cast, but we don't. Instead, what we have is a game that's already a weird parallel alternate universe version of reality, as stated by the canon, where people are fighting mirror versions of themselves on most of the maps because of how restrictive the meta is these days, and that is what's prized as the most important thing to this franchise. At the same time, though, it's a weird sort of blessing that I have engaged with more and more media that uses a toy box narrative, because fanfiction, something I have loved since I was in middle school, has not only kept up with my growth, but has acted as a salve for my future woes. It has grown up alongside me, and for that I can't thank it enough. I honestly could stop the video right here. I read more fanfiction now than I ever have because it is the way that I solve the issues that I have with a lot of the media I exist parallel towards. It's why I love it.
Right on time. Right on time.
Writing is hard. I should know, this video script is an abomination. I'm sorry. Even so, lists of kids' dream jobs almost always have the occupation of writer crack the top 10 in popularity. Of course, childhood dreams falling by the wayside and being crushed are often a part of growing up, but nothing ever great comes from overwhelming pessimism. Except for maybe Cormac McCarthy. In the modern times, there are countless resources out there for new writers to learn from, but as with many activities, preparation can only account for so much. To be set on the path of writing, something must compel you to step across the veil and actually write, free from the obligation of schoolwork or a job, but just for the sake of it. Frankly, that hasn't gotten any easier in decades, and given the extent to which we are bombarded with so many new shiny paths to instant gratification, you could contend that it has just gotten harder. In service to aspiring writers, there are two things that I hope to maintain in the current internet landscape: a format of storytelling that emphasizes the fundamentals of the craft, and a low barrier to entry for new writers to find an audience that will engage with their works enthusiastically. For as much as people argue about the virtue of fanfiction, and trust me, you will see how much they argue in future sections, the fact of the matter is that it is a great medium with which to start a writing journey, fulfilling both of these needs better than other paths early on in a writer's career. Let's start with the first point. Controversially, I think that the elements of storytelling that even the more critical, directed communities of authors would emphasize as important to learn fundamentals are actually more easily accessed if someone begins their creative writing journey with fanfiction, as long as they are responsible about the type of fanfiction they author. In a lot of circles, world building is seen as the easy part of the creative process, more of an exercise than an actually substantive element of storytelling in beginner works. It is supposed to be the backdrop for conflict and character development, the bits supposed to be more taxing on the writer and important to their improvement. There's a tendency for developing writers with grand visions to write pages upon pages of world building and backstory in preparation for a story that they often get burnt out on, oftentimes because they now have to keep all the plates of the world spinning. Starting off with fanfiction compels developing writers to devote their attention to the base mechanics of the art form, writing dialogue and forming stories that are engaging to an audience that now both exists and is easily reachable for comments and feedback. We'll get to why that is the case in a little bit, but for now, the process of world building and character creation is already done to some degree, regardless of the parent work a fanfiction writer decides to engage with. Even if that process has gaps, such as in the case of toy box storytelling methods, what legwork on this front that has to be done by aspiring authors is often to create details that sustain prolonged interactions and a plot that actually goes somewhere, the kind of things that made Symmetra and Junkrat so much more compelling in You Touch Me and I Burn than they are in the base game. In other words, it's the portion of world building and characterization that's challenging and still pushes the development of writing skills. Aspiring authors can also benefit from having a direct comparative in the parent work they are building from. In order to stay consistent and not fall to the horrible allegations of OOC, it's invaluable that the source material gets a deep reading, something that is also recommended in authorial circles in the same way that a visual artist will do studies of past masters' works. Of course, a new author doing this sort of work to inform their own original fiction is both very rare, as it's hard to temper the urge to write with hoops that they must first jump through, and there's also just more of a barrier to translating the fruits of this study into one's writing. Instead of working towards deepening how one renders the same character in a new context as with fanfiction, a new writer who is looking to translate their insights from a deep reading into their own original fiction has to adjust to the greater burden of total conversion of abstracted concepts into an entirely novel form. While the goal should be to amalgamate insights about writing from basically everything you engage in to pen something unique, it's very likely that people without the option to take a half measure and write a fanfiction will swing and miss, dropping short of this goal, and whenever goals aren't reached, another few aspiring writers will fall out of love with the discipline. Having as much granularity as possible while ramping up towards good writing is important, as people improve at different rates and require different metaphorical checkpoints in their development. So if people don't want to go whole hog and try to make this jump through masterwork studies, that's fine. Fanfiction is uniquely going to be able to cover this issue. The other side of why starting with fanfiction is smart is a virtue of space, not a virtue of content. Writing original fiction is, to use an ancient bit of internet metaphor, making a message in a bottle and then throwing it into an ocean made entirely of other messages in bottles. You can narrow your audience by the content of your work, but only to the extent to which you can give your piece a genre tag and a spiffy summary, and there's great variance in the size of communities that even have a chance at stumbling upon your work. Humanity Fuck Yeah, or HFY as it is called on its subreddit, is a micro-genre that is about optimistic science fiction or fantasy tales that center and affirm the virtues of mankind and the ethos of the human race. If you're particularly into that, well, you're in luck because there's a 300,000 users strong community out there for you to call home. For the most part, though, you're going to be lucky to find 3 or 4 dedicated readers that, importantly, are also willing to give feedback, and a lot of this just comes down to the structure of publishers being able to snap up what a lot of people perceive as good fiction and putting it out there into the world. Without that kind of backing, you're really rolling the dice on a much smaller audience. The fact that fanfiction.net pulls about 85 million viewers in a 3-month span versus its sister site Fiction Press, which got about 345,000 views during the same period, illustrates the rift, and this isn't even mentioning Archive of Our Own, which dwarfs both of them. Sure, if you're writing a fanfiction for a community that barely has any presence on the website, you might be out of luck, but most reasonably sized communities will have enough people that will take some amount of interest in your work, no matter what pairing or content you could dream of. You sick fuck. The difference in scale of audience is such that you'll often see fanfiction that is damn close to an original work wearing the skin of a parent franchise in order to access a pre-existing fandom, just so writers get access to the motivation that comes from writing for someone else. This is most commonly done by approximating the personalities of characters to broadly align with what is needed in a plot and then being very, very AU. Hell, you could probably find a BioShock Infinite fanfiction floating out there on the interwebs that's really just a detective novel wrapped up in the clothes of its main characters so that people would read it. That was my fault. I did that. Please don't actually read it. I can't imagine it'll be a good use of your time. As someone who has dabbled in both realms, gaining a following for a fanfiction is actually bizarrely meritocratic compared to the process of attracting people to regular fiction. By being about something that's already established, it is very likely that there are other works that feature the same characters and situations as yours. This is something that happens down to a very specific degree, surprisingly enough. The number of stories that follow the broad strokes of You Touch Me and I Burn, where Junkrat and Symmetra join the Recall and quickly hate each other due to sharing a work environment before slowly developing romantic feelings towards one another, all the while Overwatch grapples with the re-emergence of Talon and Symmetra attempts to free herself from the control of Vishkar, exceeds at least 8 by my count. What this means, though, is that you're thrust into a marketplace where, unless your writing is up to snuff, you're going to have your audience pulled into other fanfictions. I know that for when I'm searching for a fanfiction to read, I'll typically make a small group of works that look interesting due to their description or tags and then click in, sort of speedrunning portions of an early chapter and then of a late chapter just in case the style changes significantly. If it seems mechanically sound, then I'll probably stick with it for some deeper engagement, but if it is riddled with errors or is just really rocky in regards to its voice and perspective, I'll immediately disengage. The fact of the matter is, though, you almost always get the chance to have eyes on your story at least once, and you get to be in control of engagement in a way that is often denied to early attempts at original fiction. Another attractive thing about fanfiction's audience is that it is particularly enthusiastic in a way that is far more likely to keep aspiring writers motivated. Just as important as insightful feedback is having people swoon over your plot developments or the direction you take your characters, it's so damn gratifying, and while you can occasionally get this if you bring people deep into the fray of your original work, we've already established how it's far more of a crapshoot than in the realm of fanfiction. One unique thing that I absolutely adore about the community is its willingness to make fan art of fanfiction, or if you've really got something special on your hands, fanfiction of fanfiction. Given that fan artists are often looking to fanfiction in order to expand the types of situations they imagine characters in, such as a quieter or tender moment for someone who is mostly characterized as brutish in the canon, it's a great symbiotic relationship. Interactions of this sort also expand the community you are welcomed into by authoring fanfiction that goes beyond the specific discipline of writing. Fandom can certainly have its toxic elements, but many people find immense warmth and vibrancy, comfort amongst like-minded people in these spaces, and I want to at least give people the option to enter into them. The alternative for many people authoring original fiction is nothing. They have to build from the ground up, and on top of everything else that they have to struggle with, it's a difficult call to make. You could join a writer's lounge on Discord and occasionally get feedback, but there's always this transactional aspect of interactions in these spaces where people are sort of there to get eyes on their own story and very little else. I definitely respect the grind, but there's less collective joy that you get here than just being part of something that everyone shares love and enthusiasm for that's a bit more concrete, as writing unto itself is a little too abstract to celebrate on its own. In setting up fanfiction as this accessible way into writing with a great community, I can understand the fear that aspiring writers will simply find their home and exhaust themselves on fanfiction without leaving that realm. Hell, this can describe my arc in writing to a degree. I certainly haven't made any original fiction in recent memory after spending a long while working through fanfiction. Ultimately, though, I doubt that too many writers that would have otherwise had the will to make their way in original fiction in reality get caught in a spiral of writing only fanfiction. If they were having fits to start writing with the vision of eventually producing the great American novel, a little time to scale up with fanfiction probably will not wash away that final goal. Meanwhile, there are countless people who find their love for writing more broadly by starting with fanfiction, often drawing from the reasons for creating outlined in previous sections. If they choose to never fly the coop, so be it. I'm happy for what they've contributed either way, and I hope they're happy with what doing so has given them in return. Well, this all sounds like we're getting into me addressing arguments against fanfiction, though, the comparative between it and original fiction in particular. I guess we might as well formally transition over.
Will the circle be unbroken?
There's 3 arguments actually made in good faith against fanfiction that I generally find to be the most commonly employed by its critics. All of them revolve around how the presence of fanfiction in some way harms trends in how readers engage with media. To detractors, fanfiction is either generalized brain rot fuel that can barely be counted as literature due to the fact that it rarely offers anything challenging or valuable, occupies readers' time so that it pushes away original fiction, or it alters the expectations that people have of original fiction in a way that prevents them from interacting with difficult topics that could expand their worldview. One note before we dive headfirst into this section. I feel like I'm already doing a lot to concede ground to detractors of fanfiction because I'm trying to show the virtues of the medium in a nearly academic way where there are tangible benefits for readers and writers to interact with fanfiction that inform their greater lives as readers and writers. Personally, I don't really care about each piece of fiction someone engages with being some sort of exercise to make you a more complete person. Sometimes it's fun to read schlock or write, as the famous AO3 tag puts it, with no beta. We die like men. Most people aren't looking to turn their time with fanfiction into their push to become a top novelist. They're hobbyists looking for an outlet to their instincts that have informed why so many fanworks are even made to begin with that I have spent this whole video talking about. If it feels like I'm trying to argue that every Drabble compilation under the sun is a valuable opportunity for growth, my apologies. As we started with the most simple of fanfiction's virtues, let's work from the ground up on this side of the coin too. I've never really bought into the idea that fanfiction is like junk food in one's media diet. You can take even the most mutated, hideous fanfic out there and find its parallel in the realm of original fiction. I mean, hell, if you want to be reductive about it, fiction press exists, right? It seems to me that critics of fanfiction like to do a bit of cherry picking, at least in regards to this argument. There's absolutely horrendous, bottom-of-the-barrel writing on both sides of the original fiction-fanfiction divide, and I'm pretty sure that all the people reading Warrior's Lemon compilations right now would easily shift to places on the internet I'd be loath to travel to if there were a moratorium on fanfiction implemented tomorrow. People will find their schlock somewhere. Honestly, I think it's wrong for me to even implement a hierarchy on the value of media, although I guess I already have pointed out some fics that I absolutely would hate to read and do not think should be read by anyone, but I'm trying to meet the anti-fanfiction crowd here halfway. Regardless, given that we've established a parallel bottom floor of quality between fanfiction and original works, the argument must be that fanfiction is incapable of reaching the same heights of traditional literature, and that the people who are making arguments on this point basically just want us to read those things at the heights of traditional literature that make reading, in their opinion, worth doing. Okay, strap in, this is gonna get weird. Sorry simplicity is already out of the window, but look, we gotta address this first point, and look, I'm as much of a fan of the classics and modern classics of fiction as anyone else. Blood Meridian is my favorite book, I love Hemingway, R.K. Narayan, John Updike, and I actually had the willpower to finish the Pickwick Papers, so you can basically call me an expert in the field. I'm not going to sit here and try to argue that even the best of fanfiction could measure up to The Old Man and the Sea or The Great Gatsby or whatever other work is sanctified by either your secondary school education or an internet collective. It's just too much labor, and frankly, this video is long enough as it is. What I will urge you to do, though, is consider how many works of original fiction you would say actually exist at the peak of the medium, and what percentage of any given person's consumption of fiction is actually at this level of quality. I'm not comfortable enough to try to shoot for the very top of literature as being attainable by any given fanfiction. And if I were to try to argue this, I'd probably take a video of similar length to this one, dedicated to just one topic instead of the many that I'm trying to touch upon here. However, I am comfortable saying that there are many fanfictions that can clobber your Crazy Rich Asians or your Aragons or your Harry Potters, the sort of stuff that informs the vast majority of people's readerly diets. The scope and aspirations of these stories are just at such a level that they are easily picked up upon by fanfiction writers and converted into this new medium. Now, I'm about to offend every English major under the sun, but I'm going to try to explain what I mean by introducing a pretty shaky typology of stories in order to try to justify this. As a disclaimer, this is not a classification system that's going to hold up to much scrutiny, but inasmuch that we are mostly just going by vibes to evaluate the relative quality of original fiction and fanfiction anyways, I'm fine with rolling with it until someone on the anti-fanfiction side of things gives me a compelling means by which to compare the so-called quality of a given piece of fanfiction and a given piece of original fiction against one another. So, with that in mind, I think that you can classify characteristics of a fictional work into two broad categories, the inward-facing and the outward-facing. While these aren't synonyms for the terms internal and external, I don't want to keep saying inward-facing and outward-facing, so they'll do as approximations, This whole deal is about approximations anyways, so deal with it. Internal characteristics are things like interpersonal relationships and world building, and are tied to the fundamental components of fiction like plot, character, setting, style, and to a degree theme. External characteristics revolve around how aspects of a narrative are oriented in relation to the reader and said reader's frame of reference. It has a lion's share of the thematic dimension of fiction, as the message or topic of a story does not have to be communicated between characters in a story in order to be communicated to a reader. For instance, the external is home to more exacting commentary on how themes fit into the zeitgeist that an author aims to target with their writing. Guy Montag in Fahrenheit 451 learns throughout the course of the story that maybe burning books isn't great for the freedom of a populace, which would be the inward-facing aspect of the book's themes. Meanwhile, the story's audience are invited to reflect upon what all that book burning could in fact be a parallel to in the real world. This is what I would call the outward-facing aspect of the text's themes. Of course, there's overlap, but broadly, I think that viewing the extent to which different works of fiction focus upon the internal versus the external is a good way to gauge trends in the quality of fiction. So now that we have this system in place, it's time to get a bit controversial as I attempt to get it to work as an evaluative method for any piece of fiction. I think that generally, the better the work is, the more likely it is to be oriented towards outward-facing characteristics. Of course, it's a prerequisite to also be competent with the fundamentals that underpin internal characteristics, but ultimately these aspects are there mostly to propel the overarching narrative in novels that are considered to be at the height of the medium in order to impact out their thematic depth. To keep with Fahrenheit 451, it's a pretty slim read overall that doesn't index a ton into fleshing out the minutiae of the government that Guy acts as an agent of for much of the novel, nor does it spend a lot of time exploring the inner worlds of its characters. DK is not going to be making the complete Fahrenheit 451 visual dictionary anytime soon, which really does suck because, man, I loved those things when I was a kid, especially the Star Wars one. I read that shit until its cover fell off. Now, fiction can still be very good without aspiring to elevated external characteristics, but I think that its ceiling of quality is lowered. Really though, it's the difference between being eligible for, I don't know, top 1,000 books of all time versus top 100 books of all time, and so it's not something to really bellyache over, particularly if you're a new writer. Now, The Lord of the Rings, for instance, doesn't really angle towards a lot of external factors. It has themes of good versus evil and the redemptive power of friendship, etc., but let's be real, the Lorax has as much thematic depth at like 5% of the length. Still, The Lord of the Rings is, as I think we can mostly agree, pretty damn decent and engages more people more thoroughly than a lot of books with stronger external characteristics. This is due to the care that is taken with its inward-facing elements, and this is the realm where I believe many fanfictions can shine. Fanfictions inherently get an initial leg up in the pursuit of building its internal characteristics by virtue of having the first steps of world-building and characterization done by parent works. Now, any fanfiction that aspires to even a middling level of quality still has an immense burden placed upon it to flesh out a compelling plot and ensure that its characters and world are reoriented to best fit in with whatever the story wishes to explore, but at the very least, you don't have to pull the mechanics of a setting or characters out of the void. To continue to generalize, this is pretty good for accelerating towards the elements of inward-facing characteristics that actually bring redeeming elements to a story. The logistics of a setting and its characters, such as the name of a planet or how stuff like faster than light travel or magic works, is very rarely what brings compelling depth to a narrative, so getting them out of the way to focus upon the layering of the story upon complex characters gives such immense potential to fanfiction as a medium. The only reason I care to talk with friends about the nature of Tom Bombadil or put myself through reading the Silmarillion is because Frodo and the Fellowship's story is an epic tale that's compelling from beginning to end because Tolkien is great at rendering an almost mythical quality to his characters' interactions. I stay in the realm of the internal for LOTR because I want to read the bones and see what underpins this sense. Fanfiction is fast-tracked towards trying to write in that mythical sense or whatever more important elements of a good narrative that the author cares about, and seeing what is done on this front is why I can try to impress upon fanfiction haters that there's something to the medium to latch onto. There's arguments to be made that break down the dichotomy a bit, where one can leverage internal characteristics to bring forth external thematic depth, but I'll leave that for another time, as like I said, this already feels like more work to try to make an objective gauge of quality where there ought be none. I hope the fact that I've spent this much lip service to concocting this Rube Goldberg device to try to gauge quality that honestly falls apart at the seams has illustrated just how weird things have to get for us to even evaluate fanfiction versus regular fiction. If anyone out there is going to sit there and argue that actually my system is correct and people ought focus upon the classics and external facing texts, my only response is that you have such a myopic view of how people consume media that if you genuinely believe that, you've probably already determined that this video is not worth your precious time and have clicked off. Let's stay at the approximation station for a bit longer. What even is original fiction at its boundaries? The struggle that I have here is that while it'd be easy enough to define original fiction in opposition to fanfiction and call it a day, I feel that this definition obfuscates pain points that I'd like to confront the anti-fanfiction party with. Yes, original fiction is essentially a work of imagination whose characters and plot are the unique product of an individual or group, but where does that leave stuff like really large franchises where things are added to the canon, but it's not all done by the setting's original creator or creators? Warhammer 40,000 is an example of this kind of canon storytelling that has been in the spotlight a bit more as of late. Its universe and timeline are so expansive that writers flesh out whole worlds and histories for projects only for them to be rendered to a footnote for Life from the Black Library to make a YouTube short about. What really is the differentiation between a competently written fanfiction and something inserted into the 40k timeline, particularly if it's not a narrative that touches upon the big movers and shakers in the genre? Like, sure, someone contracted to work on this kind of story for Games Workshop is able to contribute to this nebulous blob of a canon that exists for Warhammer, and you get to be paywall behind the Black Library, but these ultimately are very post hoc, descriptive means of differentiating this mode of fiction writing from fanfiction that does nothing to speak of a work's quality. If the mode of writing a story of this sort into the Warhammer setting is not that different from how fanfiction is made, with the only difference being how external factors orient these works as canon or non-canon, then fanfiction provably has the capacity to match the quality of at least some groups of original fiction which is beloved by hundreds of thousands of people. All of this aside, I also reject the premise that there's some sort of trade-off for most people between reading fanfiction and original works. At the very least, this line of inquiry focuses on something concrete, that being reader engagement and time spent actually, reading, which is better than arguing the highfalutin ideas of objective quality between fanfiction and original fiction. But that being said, y'all want in on a little secret? Most people don't read much at all, especially not fiction for their own pleasure. Unless you're Jane McGoodreads and you've got a very particular friend group, I highly doubt more than a handful of people in your orbit have read more than 3 novels in the past year. I know that when I was in university, my reading of original fiction dwindled to basically nothing. I would jam my reading for schoolwork, research for the debate team, and then chill. And by chill, I mean spiral existentially. What did keep me engaged with reading as leisure was fanfiction. I kept up with the fics I had been following since high school, and when the mood struck me, I sought out works related to games I had been playing or shows that had caught my interest. Neither of these motivations are super tied to what would compel me to read an original work during this time of my life. Sure, serialized fiction does still exist, but I don't know, man. If I want to sit around and pray that something I'm reading will actually be completed before the sun supernovas, it better have my OTP getting quality cuddle time with one another. Maybe you can chicken or egg this and say that I'd be more open to reading original works if I didn't begin reading fanfictions to start out with, but with that, we are so divorced from the original question of this chapter as to if fanfiction is responsible for poor reading habits. As I said before, I would have read less without fanfiction. Broadly, I think that just the act of reading is good, particularly in this age where you can get more easily attained dopamine hits from basically any other entertainment medium, including YouTube video essays that go on for about an hour regarding fanfiction. That being said, I really appreciate your viewership. Ooh woo. The other dimension to the idea that fanfiction is displacing original fiction is the supposed fandomization of original works. It's very common for publishers that are aiming their books at a younger demographic to now centralize the presence of tropes in their marketing. I first noticed this back in the early 2010s with the Bookman series by Lavi Tidhar, whose omnibus published by Angry Robot had an honest-to-God tag list on the back. Diabolical anarchists, murder most foul, the end of days, what the hell is going on? I bought it. It was pretty good. As silly as that publisher decision was, the pressing fear to come out of this trend is that marketing will also skew what stories get published to fit in with very flattened market demands. It's more economically viable to churn out books that appeal to the whims of the market, and therefore publishers love that TikTok and other platforms have packaged every conceivable plot point or character archetype into taggable, digestible phenomena whose metrics can be monitored for maximum audience penetration. We are careening towards an age of algorithmically perfected literature if we aren't careful. It's definitely heartbreaking to see the publishing landscape becoming more hostile to authors who are looking to push the boundaries of fiction, but I struggle to place this indictment on anything other than the publishing industry, and I certainly wouldn't blame fanfiction for this. There's a collective trend in how we talk about media by grouping them as aesthetics and vibes that fandom might perpetuate, but unless we change the fundamental landscape of how we seek out material on the internet, a color by numbers approach to literature with all the data that the powers that be have access to seems like an inevitable threat that will exist with or without fanfiction in the equation. Hell, some of the biggest detractors of fanfiction that I know are perfectly happy to say things are aesthetic or use the suffix core on random words in order to try to create new categorizations. This is something that exists in and out of fandom, and therefore, it is a structural problem. Now, on a smaller scale, is it the case that fanfiction is directly impacting consumer behavior to seek out bad literature when they do dip their toes into original fiction? Well, that's what our final section of this debate is going to be for. This is going to be a long one, but given that we're already deep into a video that a lot of people would call a long one, I think we just gotta suck it up and give this some lip service, because I do think this is ultimately the most compelling argument I've heard against fanfiction. So, for the sake of argument, let's say that you are finishing up a work with a pretty melancholic or even downright tragic ending. Some people in your situation really don't like living with these sorts of endings if they don't have to, so some of them don't. Some of them will forge a new ending that ameliorates the perceived flaws of the original, very often in a way that forces back elements that can be disquieting or downright heartbreaking. Now, wait, this is the same mechanism that I highlighted back when I was discussing that School Rumble fanfiction at length, and I seemed down for it then, so what gives now? Well, there's a lot of these works whose themes are inseparably tied to them being, kind of bummers. Now, I think I've made it pretty clear that I have a liberal view of canon and authorial intent, but I do worry about the capacity of fanfiction to give us an easy way out of more challenging narratives, particularly if it becomes a consistent reaction when a person is confronted with difficult media. BioShock Infinite is a flawed game whose legacy will always be tied to its overpromised lead-up and copious plot holes. I say this because there's a lot of elements of this game that could be improved, and this includes via the medium of fanfiction. It also has quite the downer ending, with the protagonists voluntarily choosing to end thousands of parallel universes and their lives therein. I guess that I should explain a little bit, so time to torch canon for like a third time in this video essay. Whee! Booker DeWitt is a former Pinkerton and drunkard who, in order to repay gambling debts, is hired to rescue a girl from the floating city known as Columbia, which is full of American exceptionalists and racists, and run by a self-declared prophet known as Zachary Hale Comstock. Booker succeeds in rescuing the girl named Elizabeth, who happens to have a bunch of universe-hopping time powers, and in the process of trying to escape Columbia, he learns that Comstock is actually a parallel universe version of himself, and Elizabeth was his daughter, who he had sold to Comstock before being pulled into another timeline to wipe away his debts. Eventually, Booker and Elizabeth realize that to set things right, they have to end the universes in which Booker gave up Elizabeth and those in which he chose to become Comstock, doing so by essentially killing themselves and their multiversal counterparts. The mechanism by which this happens is confusing at best and completely indecipherable at worst. I guess they weren't called irrational games for nothing.
He's manufacturing new memories from his old ones.
That being said, it's still a really thematically potent conclusion to the game, and one of its best features. As the stars blink out along with the Elizabeth and Booker we follow throughout the whole story, you're set to wonder about the burden of choice against the backdrop of seemingly unavoidable fate, and the depths we ought be willing to go to redeem ourselves, up to and including our own self-destruction. Of course, though, fanfiction writers for the most part just want to see Elizabeth make it to the Paris that she desires, and for Booker to be straight chilling with his daughter in a New York that didn't get firebombed by white supremacists. And thus a whole cottage industry of BioShock Infinite fanfiction has sprung up, where Booker saves the day, gets the girl, and by that I mean he's reunited with his daughter, you get it, and is absolved of his sins. Most typically, this is simply done by Booker beating the shit out of old Comstock and getting the heck out of Columbia, which sorta makes sense until you realize that the whole point of Infinite's ending is that Booker is truly incapable of running from his sins. Booker becomes Comstock across many universes, and he sold his daughter to him across many others. The cycle will continue outside of fanfic Booker's periphery, and given that the Booker we play in the game has the capacity to end this suffering when no one else can, even if it's via a mechanism that doesn't actually make too much sense, the way that fanfiction authors approach this type of ending rewrite honestly makes him more of a moral failure than Booker in the canon. Reminder, the Booker we play also literally sold his daughter to repay his gambling debts. He just got time brainworms into forgetting.
He's manufacturing new memories from his old ones.
Sure, some of the fanfiction I'm referencing tries to do its part to eventually redeem Booker, most often through dialogue with Elizabeth, but, it's really just sort of having its cake and eating it too. I understand that it's possible for even great wrongs to be righted without the need for self-flagellation or martyrdom, but if a hypothetical fic, which, let's be clear here, is hypothetical because I haven't encountered an ending rewrite that genuinely does the legwork necessary to justifiably redeem Booker in this gentler way, were to actually do the work to give me a satisfying arc from Booker that hits upon the same topics as the original, I'd have to wonder what the purpose of this whole endeavor is besides a means by which to skirt past the tragedy of the canon ending. The YouTuber Quinn Curio, who I love and wish would come back to the medium, made a great point in one of her musings on fandom that I think really fits here.
Once in a while, I'll see young fans make strange arguments where they point out a way in which a fictional world is disturbing, and then they act like that's a mistake.
I think it's this common misperception that underpins why stories like those of Bioshock Infinite Death Defiance are motivated by the same fix-it mechanism of School Rumble, let's actually satisfy readers with the canon Love Polygon's characterization fix. A story that plays with discomforting themes can leave readers feeling the same way as a story that just straight up sucks or has major issues, particularly those readers who are young and still finding their own way to engage with media. This is not to say that any media is issue-free, so perhaps it's better to say that when an audience hones in on uncomfortable themes, they can do so as they do on issues relating to structure and characterization and other fundamentals of writing. It's worryingly very common for wires to get crossed so that we apply a "we must fix it" mindset to both of these things. So, is it possible that this intuition can run amok in a significant enough portion of the fanfiction reading and writing population that they find themselves never needing to confront difficult ideas in fiction because they can simply access a different telling that undoes anything that they view as uncomfortable? Maybe? Perhaps I have too much faith that people are more complex than a Pavlovian model of see sad thing, right away sad thing, but at least in my fanfiction journey, I just never really encountered this as a problem. Maybe when I was younger, I'd be more likely to not allow a good story to end on a dark note, but now, I mostly engage with fanfiction almost entirely for its three values I spent most of this video talking about. Not once have I thought that, for instance, Blood Meridian needed an alternate ending where Tobin and the kid kill Judge Holden and ride off into a sunset, because Blood Meridian bangs, and it's basically watertight as a narrative. Even if I were to go back to a very complete story to hear a different telling of its conclusion, headcanons are malleable, and there's no reason that you can't have more than one for any given setting. More seasoned readers might even tell you that this will happen naturally as you encounter different fandoms or different stories throughout your life. The aforementioned Redneck of Ranapur is actually a good example of a dual canon that I now hold. This is because it started using the Black Lagoon anime as its source material, while the manga now has a few arcs coming after the end of the anime's timeline that in turn contradict some of the fanfiction's plot. So yeah, I just keep those two narratives divorced in my mind. Benny and Jane break up in one, and the relationship remains stable in the other. Similarly, things like Game of Thrones exist, which have gotten a completely different narrative, or at least what I hope will be a completely different narrative, from what exists in the books via the TV show, and many people will consider both as canon as George R.R. Martin hopefully finishes the series in text. That being said, the fact that there are so many fanfictions out there which do exactly what I'm complaining about is great ammunition for the anti-fanfiction crowd. It's objective truth that at least some portion of the community does want to write happily ever after endings for any given piece of fiction. So, how can we as a community encourage a different approach to the sort of feelings that motivate the creation of these fics? To me, it's more about a nudge than a total redirection. Ultimately, people are going to have different opinions about what is a flaw in a property versus a critical element in delivering the work's message, so let's sidestep trying to parse which is which and instead push for fics to be authored for reasons beyond fix it. This is in general just good writing advice too, I think. The fate of so many fics in this realm is to careen towards a resolution that the author so desperately wants to reach, and then we sit and watch as characters putter around for another 100,000 words without much direction. If you really want, we can turn an eye back to my inward-facing and outward-facing dichotomy and encourage some more consideration to be given towards the latter. Let's take a look back at the hypothetical BioShock Infinite fanfiction to work as an example. By endeavoring to expand the scope of Infinite's thematic core, I think we get an answer as to how the fic could be thematically satisfying. By grasping beyond the boundaries of what the source work wanted to explore, we can justify keeping Booker and Elizabeth alive in order to enter into these new discourses. Hell, perhaps a story could specifically question the necessity for extreme self-imposed suffering as a character endeavors to redeem themselves. I'd also love to see someone write a story about Booker and Elizabeth debating over the moral responsibility that they have regarding their quantum selves. Like, maybe this really is just a justifiable fuck you got mine scenario. So, Booker, Elizabeth, enjoy your time in Paris. Before I leave you to the wild blue or red yonder, depending on your website of choice, I do want to create space for the one kind of wish fulfillment fanfiction that I have a soft spot for, and that I think is perfectly deserved. Regardless of what bad habits they bring out or what themes they trample, works that restore agency to its female, LGBT, or otherwise marginalized characters will have a right to exist for as long as the world continues on as it always has. That is really shittily for a lot of people. People are murdered in cold blood for the sheer gall to be their authentic selves. It's a place where despotic robber barons propped up by ill-gotten wealth strive to legislate away agency and solvency for the downtrodden at all levels of government. It makes sense that under these circumstances, some number of people confront and question these factors in their lives through fanfiction, often doing so with great exuberance. There's a reason why the Everyone is Gay tag on Archive of Our Own has nearly 27,000 stories listed. In light of an industry that counts people different from the cis, straight, white norm as statistical oddities to be extracted from, sometimes having a little fun by being the majority for once is deserved. They may not be the greatest pieces of literature, I can attest to that, but I love them as singular expressions to reclaim what was denied to the marginalized fans who imagine peace for themselves and their community through these works. I spoke for a bit about how one of fanfiction's great virtues is that it brings young authors into more direct contact with communities that can give them support. Critically, it often does not just come in the form of support as a writer, but it can be in support as a woman or a person of color or a trans person. Crushing anxieties about identities jeopardized by the powers that be can be shared and for a moment ameliorated by found family from screen to screen. As per usual, fanfiction in these communities also has to occasionally perform the role of repair. We exist in a media landscape where tropes like women in fridges are commonplace enough to be reified. In light of that, there's plenty of work to be done by those who often are in the worst places to put in labor to rehabilitate the products of millionaires who don't give a shit about them. Yet it is in fact done for the sheer love of the franchise and the sheer love of the others who deserve to see elements of themselves depicted as thriving and as alive as anyone else. Sherlock is garbage. If you've made it this far into a video essay about fanfiction, you probably roll with the internet groups who have already told you this, or you know it firsthand. As the famous 4chan post says, Sherlock is a smart person written by a stupid person to whom smart people are indistinguishable from wizards, making most of the mystery of this mystery show completely unfollowable as its main character hops from conclusion to conclusion without any time for the audience to breathe or apply their own deductive reasoning to the situation. If you want other, more generalized criticisms, though, there are plenty of other places on the internet for you to find them. In general, attitudes towards the entirety of the show, and hell, Stephen Moffat's entire oeuvre, have soured immensely in the past half-decade. I want to zoom in on how Sherlock fundamentally failed the queer community, though. The vast majority of Sherlock Holmes adaptations from the past half-century or so are fanfiction, if you think about it. I don't even really mean this in the memey, haha, the Divine Comedy is just Bible fanfiction kind of way. Adaptations of Arthur Conan Doyle's original works will commonly deepen the characteristics of its main character, who is very much a mystery-solving machine with a few idiosyncrasies in the source material. Imagine him in a profoundly different setting, most often via modernization, or just get weird as hell with it. These are all deeply fanfictionized activities, if I do say so myself, and it makes sense that Sherlock Holmes would be the type of story that finds itself in constant discourse with fan works, be they with a massive studio backing or not. It's sort of a toy box narrative where Holmes and Watson are packaged characters with an archetypal mode of interaction that can be transposed from plot to plot and concept to concept. There's plot progression in Arthur Conan Doyle's original canon, with Sherlock supposedly dying at Reichenbach Falls, but even that wasn't permanent. It was the perfect sort of story for people to develop, either by just throwing the characters into the same formula of mystery solving that made them famous in the first place, imagining them in new scenarios with often greater stakes than a single murder to be solved, or, most importantly for us, speculating on the relationship between Holmes and Watson and where it could possibly go. Shipping Holmes and Watson across tellings is a foundational gay fandom activity. It might be the oldest established ship of its kind, and was second in popularity only to Kirk and Spock shipping that grew from the primordial ooze of early fandom back in the 1970s. Sherlock was, to many enthusiastic fans, going to be the one version of the Sherlock Holmes story that was going to finally show a conception of the universe in which Holmes and Watson are in fact romantically entwined, and the show itself did not do a whole lot early on to dissuade speculation on the topic. John Locke is something that kind of deserves not only its own video, but a comprehensive graduate level course to get the full scope of it though, so I can't get into the full list of ways that people were queer-baited by this show. Suffice it to say that I've seen less bait at a Bass Pro Shop. From episode 1 they lay it on thick, with Sherlock denying any attraction to women and him and Watson being mistaken for a couple. As the seasons progress, others constantly question and speculate on the nature of John Watson and Sherlock's relationship, almost as if they were audience surrogates, but things begin to get shaky as the show repeatedly lampshades a possible romance between the two with fake-out confession scenes and the like. This isn't even to mention the other giant red flag about how Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat would treat gay characters, that is, the utter character assassination of Irene Adler, a self-professed lesbian in the show that isn't even given the dignity of a stable relationship with another woman. Instead, she's apparently enamored with Sherlock because he's so smart and socially well-adjusted and totally doesn't look like an otter. Regardless, by the 4th season, the show was basically coasting on the John Locke ship just to stay in the public consciousness, and did its due diligence to keep those invested in it watching up until the very end. So, did Sherlock eventually get its two leads to shack up as the overwhelming audience pressure demanded? Of course not. It's a Stephen Moffat project. The response was about as level-headed as you'd expect. Compared to the other properties that we have seen so far, in which I view fanfiction as actualizing the potential of the source material in a way that the canon can never quite reach, even in cases where franchises had deservedly to be massively overhauled through a fix-it style of fanfiction, I think it's justifiable to view the reaction of the Sherlock fandom in particular and the type of content they made in a more specifically confrontational light. Certainly, anger has galvanized fan communities before. In particular, I remembered that the How I Met Your Mother fandom was apoplectic with the ending their show got a few years prior to Sherlock's conclusion, but this was the first time that a property so intertwined with online fandom had its adherents collectively respond in real time to a conclusion that was so widely hated and that so thoroughly crushed the hopes of a young, oftentimes queer audience. A few years later, Game of Thrones' TV run inspired an outpouring of fanfiction in much the same way, but in that fandom's case, they still had the books at least to look forward to. Well, maybe. Fuck, man. Regardless, Sherlock's ending was sort of a singular event in the realm of fanfiction, and the numbers tell us everything we need to know. Out of the 83,000 or so works on Archive of Our Own that include both Sherlock and Watson in the fandom, almost 64,000 of them explicitly have the two of them in a romantic relationship. Nearly 80% is an insane statistic. This is a ship that goes beyond simply reclaiming the characters from a broken canon. The sheer weight of the number of imagined realities that these two have together constitutes a statement from the community, a fuck you to the showrunners and welcoming arms for all those who sought comfort in their identities through Sherlock and found nothing but mockery from the source material. It's an ocean of content that one can dive into for a lifetime, or at least until they find themselves cleansed of the canon. I called this section an addendum only because of how it is the nexus of so many different narratives surrounding the role and value of fanfiction that are good to get a feel for first. The virtue of reclamation is as important as all I have spent so much time on before, and importantly, it deepens these valuable aspects of the medium. For some stories, their failure to actually tell the story of marginalized people in their casts of characters is a flaw that fans shouldn't live with, and with fanworks as their tool, it can and will be fixed. For others, such as those with toy box elements, the imagining of LGBT and otherwise minority characters is not enough when they are held in stasis by the virtue of the storytelling medium that they are in. Fanfiction allows for readers of these identities to render what these arcs would be like, and in doing so, they build virtual spaces in the cultural imaginary for other fans who in some way feel pushed to the periphery of much of popular culture to finally flourish in and celebrate. There's a lot we end up outgrowing. My memories are littered with hobbies that went nowhere, and stories that once occupied my time are little more than background noise now. It still surprises me that fanfiction has not only stuck with me as a fundamental building block of my media engagement, but it has grown in importance as I have aged. When I was a middle schooler seeking out a continuation to Maximum Ride of all things because the books weren't being released fast enough for my liking, I wasn't thinking in terms of how fanfiction would reflect on my reading habits or what its potential to be a corrective for flawed narratives was. I simply loved how fanfiction was a refuge from the real, yet also a more personal reflection of my life in many ways than original literature. Nowadays, while I'm more conscious of all of these elements, the reason I stay up late at night to ruin my sleep schedule for a real adult job now is what drew me to fanfiction all those years ago. I've navigated my identity in the light of fanfiction. Writing and reading in this realm has helped me to come to terms with disorders and confusions that have run rampant in my psyche in the past. I am a kinder person now because of fanfiction and the people I have connected to through it. In the same way as a series becomes more complete through the contribution of its fans, fanfiction helped to complete me and will undoubtedly do so again. To the detractors, my final message is that fanfiction will never die. As long as people exist, they will fall in love with the media that shapes them, and some portion of these fans will go on to write fanfiction. To me, it seems like a waste to ignore the medium as a whole when there is doubtlessly a fanfiction out there that would fix a story you had a grievance with, or expand something you love but ended too soon into a brand new setting full of new tales for the characters you've grown attached to. Give it a chance. To all of the people who have stuck with this video until the very end, thanks for spending some time giving fanfiction and me a fair shake. I love you all, and appreciate your tolerance of my constant tangents. Hell, I spent as much time talking you guys through gripes I have with some of my favorite franchises as I did actually talking about fanfiction as a medium. I hope that if you ever have had a similar desire to romp through your favorite things and see what can be done better, or what more there is to be said through them, you're inspired to turn your eyes to fanfiction at least a few times as either a reader or writer. You don't always have to fight the natural intuition to see your favorite characters expand outside the scope of their source material, nor do you have to be content with the slow trickle of lore from corporations you know are only in it to sell more game cosmetics and battle passes. Stories are the distillation of our aspirations, fears, joys, of us, of you and me. To take part in the revelry that surrounds and expands the works that make us who we are is something to be treasured. It is why I love fanfiction. Hey, I'm Anomi. Thank you so much for sitting through this entire video. This is hopefully going to be the first of many, and I don't know if I'm going to stick with fanfiction as a main topic or anything like that, but certainly I have plenty of ideas to expand this space. So if you want to see that, drop a like, drop a subscribe, and maybe a comment, but I have tons of other ideas in the pipeline as well, so hopefully you're going to continue to enjoy what I put out here. Once again, love you all. Thank you so much. Oto kono kawa ona no kono koto itsumo. O ikaketeru ichi nichiju ona na kono koto bakari. Kangaiteru.